Alicia. I'm a sophomore communication studies and journalism major here. A couple fun facts about me. I was born in southern Minnesota and raised in central North Dakota, so I go to school right in the middle of those. And I didn't actually come to college with the intention of growing in my faith, but that is what ended up happening. So that's super cool. But tonight I am going to be talking about Moses, specifically Exodus 3, the story of the burning bush. And so I'm going to pray quick and then we'll jump right into it. Dear Heavenly Father, I just thank you so much for gathering us all here tonight. I thank you, Lord, that you are present with us here. God, I just pray that you would give me the words to say and speak through me, and just, continue to reveal to us, Lord, things about you and about your character. Amen. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of context of Exodus 3. So, the Israelites at this point, they're in slavery in Egypt. And Moses is actually born while they're in slavery in Egypt. And when he is born, there is an order out that all the baby boys of the Israelites are to be killed because the Pharaoh was worried about them becoming too strong of a nation. So Moses' mother actually saves him by putting him in a basket in the Nile River. And he ends up floating along the river to where the princess, Pharaoh's daughter, is taking a bath. And she sees him and draws him out of the water, and he's like, hey, here's this kid, I'm going to keep it. So she decides to adopt him and raise him in the palace. So Moses is this Israelite boy who is raised as an Egyptian in the palace. And about 40 years later, he witnesses an Israelite being mistreated by an Egyptian. And so he actually ends up killing that Egyptian. And Pharaoh catches wind of this. So Moses decides to flee across the wilderness to this place called Midian. So that's kind of where this story picks up again. When Moses has been in Midian for about 40 years. He went there to basically settle down, have a family, and become a shepherd. So that's where he's at. So the three things that, only three things, but three things that I think we can learn from the story of Moses are the importance of turning to God in the ordinary, realizing who God is, and responding to that with trust. So I'm going to jump in to Exodus 3, starting with verses 1 through 4. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a burning bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. So, Moses is in the desert, walking along, keeping track of his sheep, and he sees this burning bush. And something that I definitely didn't know before doing some research on this was that for Moses, it actually would have been a pretty common experience to see a bush on fire in the desert. Because if you think about it, super dry, super hot, things catch on fire. So the type of bush that people think this is, it's called a sneh, S-N-E-H. And they're very common in the desert, and they actually reseed by catching fire. So it takes about 60 to 90 seconds for the bush to burn up completely. So Moses had to have been stopped and looking at this bush for more than 60 seconds. So he needed to be present and focused, maybe a little distracted from his sheep. But this allowed Moses to see the extraordinary in the ordinary. Something that I think is important about this is that God didn't speak to Moses to catch his attention. He didn't yell Moses' name, and then Moses quick turned to look at God. It wasn't until Moses started approaching the bush that God called out to him. So I think this can relate to us today too. I think a lot of times we want to hear from God, but we don't look to him first. And this isn't to say that God can't speak to us in amazing, miraculous ways, but it's just the fact that we can see the Lord in everyday occurrences if we are focused on him. So yeah, a lot of times, at least me, sometimes I feel like God isn't speaking to me, but then I have to think about, am I giving God my attention? Because I think that's something that's really easy to overlook, especially as college students when we're just super overwhelmed with everything and stress. It might be really hard to just take time to focus on God. But yes, so God revealed himself to Moses through something that was seen as ordinary. So the next part is jumping into God revealing who he is. So I'm going to jump to verse 6. And this is the Lord speaking. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Then we're going to jump forward just a little bit. But basically God says, I've seen my people struggling, and I've heard their cry for help. And I am going to rescue them and deliver them to this great land. And Moses, I am going to use you to do that. I'm going to use you to lead them. And after this, Moses is a little bit concerned. And God says to him, I will be with you. You need to trust me. So jumping forward to verse 13, we read, Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. So the first thing that God says to Moses is that he is the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And this is something that is said throughout the Old Testament and even a couple times in the New Testament. And this reminded Moses and reminds us that God is the same God of the covenant that he made with his people. This wasn't some new version of God that was meeting with Moses, but it was the same God that made promises to generations before him and carried them out. So it's basically stating that God hasn't and he will not change. And the next thing that God says to Moses is, I am who I am, which the original Hebrew for this is Ehe Asher Ehe. Probably didn't say that right, but this also could be translated to I will be who I will be. And this is related to the name Yahweh, which is God's personal name. And I am who I am might seem a little bit weird at first, but I think this is a statement that God has no equal, and also another statement of God's consistency. So basically, if you can think of any attribute about God, anything about him that is from the Bible and biblical, he is going to be that thing forever. So if God is compassionate, he is compassionate all the time. If he says he loves us all the time. And if he says he will be with us, he will be with us all the time. And I just think that's so cool. So I encourage you guys to think about how well do you know God? And anything you can think of about God will remain true forever because he's true to his character. The third thing about this statement of I am who I am is that it relates to Jesus' I am statements that he makes in the book of John. So 1,500 years later, Jesus makes very similar statements to what God said to Moses. For example, Jesus said, I am the bread of life, meaning he satisfies us. I am the light of the world, meaning when we're with him, we don't walk in darkness. and I am the door for the sheep. There is one door to God, and that door is Jesus. And he says other things like this, but I think it's really cool that God is connected all throughout the Bible in very similar ways, and this just tells us more about God himself. So God reveals himself to Moses, and then what happens is God calls Moses to trust him. So I'm going to start reading again at verse 16. Go assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared to me and said, I have watched over you and have seen what has been done to you in Egypt. And I have promised to bring you out of your misery in Egypt, into the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. The elders of Israel will listen to you, and you and the elders are to go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand compels him. So I will stretch out my hand and strike the Egyptians with all the wonders that I will perform among them. After that, he will let you go. So basically what God does is he gives Moses the game plan for what's going to happen. He briefs him on what's to come and does say that there will be a couple setbacks, like Pharaoh is not going to let them go right away. But God makes sure that Moses knows that this is ultimately going to be a victory and an ultimate success. So after some doubt and some hesitation and excuse making, Moses trusted God. We actually read a little bit later on that Moses reminds the Lord that he doesn't speak well and a few other things, and God just reassures him, saying, I will help you speak and teach you what to say. And God just makes it very clear that he is to be trusted, and that he is who he says he is, and he will do what he says he will do. Another thing that I just think is super cool about this is that God could have done all of this just by himself. He could have moved Pharaoh's heart to just randomly let them go one day, but God he chose to use Moses and work through him, and just like God does for us today. It's still true. We're still called to do God's work. And just because of who God is, this shouldn't feel like some sort of obligation, but it should feel like an amazing privilege to have the Lord work through you. And the last thing about God's call for Moses to trust him is that Moses doesn't really know where he's going. He knows that they're going to get out of Egypt, but he doesn't at this point know a whole lot about what is to come. And the Israelites actually end up wandering in the desert for 40 years. So Moses didn't know where he was going, but what he did know was where he came from and what God had done for him in the past. So that's something that can really relate to us too, because a lot of times, we don't know where we're going. We don't really have plans, or our plans kind of get flipped around on us. But the same God that has been with us all of the time is going forward with us and leading us into our future. So that's super cool. So just to recap a little bit, tonight we talked about seeing God in the ordinary, learning more about who he is, and trusting him even when we don't know where we're going. And I would just challenge you guys to think about, how is God trying to get your attention? Really try to recognize your burning bush. Strive to know more about God and respond to the Lord's call for you to trust him. Let's pray. Dear Lord, I just thank you so much for everything that you've done in our lives, Lord. I thank you for the amazing ways in which you've moved. And I thank you for your character. I thank you that you're compassionate and you love us and that you're trustworthy. And I thank you that that never changes. And I just pray that the fact that you never change would just give us peace and carry us forward, just living in that peace. Lord, I pray that you would really really help each and every one of us to realize the little ways in which you try to get our attention and realize you in the small things. And I pray that we would just respond to that by trusting you. Amen.